Hi, I'm Michael Stittle.
And I'm Nick Nanos.
And welcome to Trendline. We're back. The MPs are back in the House. Nick, you've got some good news for Conservative Leader Erin O'Toole later on. And
Yeah.
we're gonna have our first ever guest, former ambassador to the U.S. Michael Kergin will be joining us in the second half of the show. So first, let's get to our power index. What's the news on the Conservatives?
Well, it's 2021. Who would have thought? And, TikTok, there's probably going to be an election sometime. It's interesting. We track every week who Canadians would prefer as prime minister. And usually whoever the incumbent is does very well on this. Like Stephen Harper did well on this when he was prime minister. Justin Trudeau is doing well. Right now, he's the choice of about 37% of Canadians. But the numbers for Mr. O'Toole have moved in the last couple of weeks. He's at 26% as a choice, which is still 11 points back of Justin Trudeau. However, in the last 4 weeks, he's picked up a whopping 6 percentage points. A lot of those in the last week. Remember what happened last week? He was dealing with Mr. Sloan and whether he should remain or not remain in caucus. So it looks like it got a bit of we're gonna call it the Sloan bump, but there's something going on right there. And right now, at least, it looks like it's helping Erin O'Toole when it comes to his personal brand.
So again, Derek Sloan got a donation from a white nationalist, and then the party voted to kick him out of caucus. But Sloan has had a history of saying very extreme, controversial, let's say, things. During Andrew Scheer's time as leader, Derek Sloan suggested that Dr. Theresa Tam might have loyalties to China, not Canada. I mean, why did the Conservatives take action now, do you think?
Well, the thing is for Erin O'Toole, he's still a new face, at least from the general public, as the leader of the Conservative Party. Canadians are waiting to see what direction he wants to take the party in, what he's willing to tolerate and not tolerate. And this was basically a bit of a test for him in terms of Canadians getting an understanding of how he felt about kind of more extreme views and issues related to that. And it looks like Mr. O'Toole and his caucus have come out squarely against this type of politics. And I think for some Canadians who are, what we say, kicking the tires for the Conservatives, that at least in the short term and what we're seeing in the polling is a little bit of a bump for him, but he's still got a long way to go before he becomes prime minister, but a little bit of positive news in terms of his personal trend line.
Now, Nick, how influential do you think sort of fringe views are on a party as big as the Conservative Party? I mean, is Derek Sloan sort of a rare example, or are there more?
Well, think of it this way. Whenever we do our weekly tracking, there's still Canadians that said that they would vote for the party led by Maxime Bernier, the People's Party. It's anywhere from 3 to 5%. So it's 1 out of every 20, I guess. So Michael, think of it this way: for us and our viewers, listeners, walk down your neighborhood. Once you pass 20 homes, one of those people are probably hot or like the People's Party, and that's a significant number. When you think our elections are won with just a handful of percentage points, to have 3 to 5% as part of I'll say, why don't we just call them not mainstream conservatives, is quite significant. The fact of the matter is for those voters, are they going to vote for an alternative to the Conservatives and perhaps help the Liberals win? Or are they going to hold their nose and vote for the Conservatives? It's kind of like who they hate least, I guess. I don't know. But just that's where strategic voting kicks in. But not to be dismissed as a movement, but not as strong and prevalent as we've seen in the polling in the United States, for sure.
Well, I mean, in the United States, we saw this shocking rioting at the U.S. Capitol, and you can see a lot of very extreme views have sort of found their way into the Republican Party. I think the House of Representatives, it's a lot of representatives from gerrymandered districts where they don't need to sort of reach across the political divide to get elected in their districts, I suppose. So do you think, we have the People's Party, but do you think Canada is largely immune from that level of extreme views?
I don't think it's immune from those level of from maybe that level of extreme views, but not by having extreme views as part of the mix. because, let's face it, for many Canadians, they look at what's going on in the United States and they're either repulsed or are okay with some of the things that they see. And, even in Canada, our brand or our strain of populism has most likely kind of been regionally based. We had the Reform Party was a strain of populism.
Mm-hmm.
The new Maverick Party that is looking at running seats is populist. The old how about we pull out the old time machine for Trendline in New Brunswick, the Confederation of Regions was a populist movement.
Right.
And a lot of these were very regionally based. They weren't based on race. They weren't based on religion. It was based on regional anger, regional populism, trying to send a message to Ottawa, believing that Ottawa was out of touch and needed to be shaken up.
So the Maverick Party, which you mentioned, they've grown out of the Wexit movement. I mean, it has a long tradition in Canada of Western alienation and legitimate concerns about not being adequately represented in Ottawa. How influential do you think that party might be going forward? And should the federal Conservative Party keep an eye on them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they'll be very influential regionally for sure in Alberta, Saskatchewan. I also think they will be exceptionally influential on the Conservative strategy. Because the Conservative strategy is going to need to recognize that sentiment, but at the same time, try to keep that sentiment underneath the Conservative umbrella in order to defeat the Liberals. And so they're probably going to punch above their weight when it comes to influence on the Conservative platform. And they'll also probably punch above their weight regionally. But the question will be, will those voters, are they angry enough to split the Conservative vote in some ridings in order to help the Liberals? And the Maverick Party, my last point is the Maverick Party is trying to identify ridings where that vote splitting won't happen to help the Liberals. But the fact of the matter is, if the Conservatives lose a vote to anyone, it's not good for the Conservative Party of Canada.
Nick, you've also done a recent survey on how Canadians feel currently about the closure to non-essential travel at the Canada-U.S. border. So what did you find out?
It's one of those things where it's quite clear in the survey that we did that the vast majority, almost 9 out of every 10 Canadians support or somewhat support the closure of the border to non-essential travel. And this is where, we're moving into an area where, before the pandemic and the COVID-19 virus was a threat from within, now we're seeing increasing numbers of the pandemic as a threat from without, as in new strains coming from countries like the United Kingdom and Brazil. And as a result, on the border front, Canadians really want to keep it closed until the pandemic and the COVID-19 is under control.
What about lockdown measures in terms of closing businesses? Are Canadians still supportive of that?
It's a little more of a mixed bag because there's still a lot of sympathy for Canadian business. The Canadians are cross-pressured. They're torn. Like, let's face it, everyone wants to be safe. Everyone wants to be healthy. No one wants the pandemic to spread. At the same time, Canadians need jobs. Small businesses need help. And limiting and shuttering small businesses, especially in the hospitality and retail sector, is just devastating for certain parts of our economy. So it's much more of a mixed bag. That said, Canadians are still overwhelmingly concerned about the pandemic and the coronavirus. When we ask the top national issue of concern, it's way high. It's way up there. Like 42% identify coronavirus as their top concern. Jobs is at 12%, health at 8%. So that focus on the pandemic is still there, but there's still a lot of sympathy and sensitivity to businesses that are trying to survive this pandemic.
So, Nick, as your data suggests, we're in no hurry to reopen the U.S. border to non-essential travel. And to help us make sense of our changing relationship to the U.S. and to China, we are now joined by former ambassador to the U.S., Michael Kerrigan. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you very much, Michael. Glad to be with you and Nick. Absolutely.
So we have a new administration, President Joe Biden, but after 4 years of Trump's handling of the pandemic, do you think it's really created a lasting impact on how Canadians view the U.S.?
I think handling the pandemic probably hasn't had a great impact on Canadians. Certainly, how he's managed and being someone who's a demagogue who has riled up and incited violence and been very inconsistent in his foreign policy, not working traditionally with his allies. Those are lasting problems of the Trump, and many of us, I think, and many Canadians will be looking to see whether Biden can kind of reconstitute what is more the traditional U.S. policy towards its allies. But that, I think, is a much more critical question. Certainly, there's a lot of optimism and a lot of anticipation, but at the same time, it has to be tempered with the thought that the United States is extremely bitterly divided, both politically. His Senate, as you know, is at 50-50 with the Vice President Kamala Harris throwing the deciding vote. But nevertheless, you lose one Democrat or two Democrats on legislative programs that Biden wants to put through, which are quite ambitious. It's going to be very difficult for him to get his agenda through. The agenda that he has, though, Michael, I think is one that Canadians are quite comfortable with. When you sort of look at the environment, you look at his efforts to re-engage internationally with allies, with the multilateral institutions. These are areas that Canada's traditionally been very supportive of. So I think there's a lot of hope and optimism, but very much tempered by a recognition that the politics of it in the United States are going to be very, very difficult for the president. And we'll have to just hold our breath to see how much he can accomplish of what is apparently and seems to be a very ambitious agenda.
You mentioned, sorry,
It's interesting, Michael. I remember we did a poll. One of the polls that we did, we asked about what contributes to a positive relationship between Canada and the United States, and it'd be like legislators working together, the president and the prime minister working together, and what the poll suggested was tone at the top. Really, that if there was a perception that the prime minister had a fair and good working relationship with the president, that actually would be a key signal. And I think to your point, Michael, Canadians have to think it's got to be better than it was. But to your point, I think we're still hostage to a certain extent of the domestic political situation in the United States that you rightly put your finger on.
Nick, I just want to touch on something Michael said. He said, Biden has a very ambitious climate plan. And when you have tracked the major issues that, the Canadians rank, climate has always been there, and you see it as growing. So how does that impact our relations?
Well, the thing is, it could be something of alignment, because we do know from recent research that we did with the University of Ottawa that Canadians want to be a little more, are okay with being, what I'll say, climate ambitious, even if it costs jobs. But here's the kicker, and I'm not sure, I'm sure Michael can add something to this. Canadians always gauge themselves against the United States. So why don't we just look at the environment? If we have an environmental program that is on par with the United States or better than the United States, we're feeling okay. But if Joe Biden comes out with an environmental program and platform that is more ambitious than Canada, Canadians are not going to feel good. So, the big question is, how ambitious will President Biden be on the environment, and what will the impact be on the Canadian domestic kind of environmental platform?
That's absolutely true, Nick. If Biden starts to leapfrog Canadian, for example, in greenhouse gas emissions or tailpipe emissions and that sort of thing, that obviously will pose problems. It'll pose up problems economically for our exports to the United States, because if our exports are not perceived by the Biden administration to be have inputs that are environmentally friendly, we could see the imposition of what they call border carbon taxes, or that could be against us. I think the fact of the matter is, though, is that Biden is going to be constrained in being too ambitious on the environment, going back to the problems he has with the Senate and even with the House, which is a very, very narrow majority. So his key swing vote on the Democratic side is Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin is the senator from West Virginia, Democrat, and he's going to be holding back a little bit on anything that looks as being too ambitious when it comes to fossil fuels. So that's one problem. The other problem we have, Nick, obviously, is if you see the problem from the other side of the equation, is that Biden, as you know, the very first day he rescinded the Keystone pipeline thing, and that for our Alberta and for our resource base industry in Saskatchewan and so on is a problem, because they're now saying, well, how do we get our fossil fuels to Tidewater when we don't have, the Trans Mountain pipeline built yet? So we're kind of between two extremes there. On one side, we want to get more fossil fuels into the U.S. because it's good for our export industry. On the other side, we have to be careful to stay up with the Americans, because I think Nick's absolutely right. If Canadian population feels that we're falling behind the Americans, that'll have a political cost, I think, in Ottawa for sure.
I was curious to you, Nick. The Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was pretty quick to kind of put the Keystone issue behind us. Do you think that was the appropriate political reaction for him?
Yeah, this was dead in the water as soon as we knew that as soon as Biden was going to win, that this would be at the top of the list. It's an easy lift for him. It's an executive order. It allows him to tick a box and send a signal to some of the more progressive parts of his party. And the fact of the matter is America's energy self-sufficient now. So it's not, we don't have the same kind of heft and levers that we did 15, 20 years ago. And but what Ambassador Kergin has put his finger on, which is critical, is it just takes one senator can hold this administration hostage because of this 50-50 split. So this is a whole new dynamic compared to the past, where at least the Republicans had a little bit more of a working majority in the Senate.
That's right. Absolutely.
Right off the bat, I think the filibustering became an issue where Mitch McConnell wasn't willing to let that go at the start. So they were really off to a rocky start. Michael, I want to get into our relations with China now. I mean, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig have been in detention for quite a long time now. Under the previous U.S. administration, our prime minister asked Trump to address the issue with China, and we didn't see any change in their situation. So what was the lesson from there? And do you think the Biden administration will be able to help?
This is a difficult file, Michael, and it's a subterranean file because we don't really know below the surface what is exactly happening. Remember that the extradition against Madame Meng was brought by the Department of Justice. It's seen as a legal issue from the American perspective. You can agree or not agree with the sanctions and all the rest of it, but from their perspective, it's a legal issue. What made it a bit political was at one point, Donald Trump said, well, maybe, or implied in our trading relationship with China, maybe I can do something, which was from a perspective of the law, was a anomaly with respect to how you deal with extradition issues. Now, Biden has made it very clear that the Department of Justice is absolutely independent of the political arena. He's got Merrick Garland as his attorney general, and he's made that a very, so my sense of it is that Biden will be very respectful of the legal aspects of this. The legal aspects are that the extradition treaty is still, the call on Meng is still there. We have seen reports in the Wall Street Journal that they may have offered a deferred prosecution agreement, a DPA, to Meng's lawyers. For the moment, she has not accepted those. She's probably waiting until next month, where there's going to be another hearing on the whole issue, whether her rights were violated in the form and process of detention when she was detained off the aircraft when she was transiting into Mexico. We don't know whether Meng will accept a deferred prosecution agreements. You may wait to see what happens in this next trial hearing. The actual trial, I believe, is in April, where they then get it down to the issue of the question of whether she was actually guilty in terms of the of what the Americans are alleging. So we don't know whether Meng is going to accept a deferred prosecution agreement. Secondly, we don't know if the American offer of a deferred prosecution agreement is conditional on the two Michaels being released. We don't know that. It could be, it might not be. Secondly, we don't know whether, if it were linkage, whether the Chinese would accept that, because they've been saying the two Michaels are subject to espionage charges, and they say there's no linkage between those two. So there's a number of issues here that are hurdles that have to go through. So I don't think things are going to move very quickly on this one, as far as I can tell. And I do not see Biden interfering with the process politically that now is very much in a legal sort of channel. So I think while Biden is informed about it, and they talked about it in their phone call just recently, my guess is that the Biden is going to kind of let this thing play out for a while.
You know, this, if we were to sum this whole thing up, it's kind of like we've got the Chinese rock and the American hard place, and we're stuck in between.
Yes,
there's no easy solution for this. But one thing that we do know, you know, Canadians aren't experts in extradition things, on trade issues, on technology and all that stuff. But, you know, what we've seen through the polling is what's seeping through is kind of Canadians increasingly being hesitant about better relations with China. It's kind of like all these things are kind of adding up where it's on the radar for an average Canadian. You know, one survey that we did actually with CTV News, which just was quite surprising for me, because Canada is a trading nation, is when we asked Canadians whether they think that we should trade more or less or the same amount with China, by a margin of more than 4-1, Canadians said we should have less trade with China. And this is at the same time where Canadians understand that China is one of the two most important and biggest markets in the world, and that maybe in 10 years could even overtake the United States in terms of size. And but the complexities that former Ambassador Kergin is talking about, and the difficulty in having any kind of resolution, just casts a pall on the Canada-China relationship right now. And I think it's at like loggerheads. No one knows how to break the logjam on this.
Michael, it's always been a tension with China between human rights and trade. I mean, in your time as ambassador, I remember then Prime Minister Jean Chrétien was leading trade missions as well, and the question always came up: how reasonable is it to Canadians expect us to trade less with China? Is that possible?
I think it is possible, Michael. It's always a tricky file, that balance between the profits you get from selling your goods abroad and respecting human rights norms, which Canada obviously subscribes to internationally and multinationally. I mean, just look at the LAV exports to Saudi Arabia, and you see that dynamic or that conflict playing out quite obviously. I think with China, we actually do have options with China. We are fortunate that we are part of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which opens up theoretically a better trading relationship for Canada with other members of Asia, ASEAN, for example, Vietnam. And these are countries that are economically becoming more interesting markets. Their economies are developing. They're developing a middle class. They need natural resources. So we probably have some options diversifying our trade on one side. On the other side is that Canadians are becoming increasingly, as Nick has put it so well, worried about the Chinese sort of predatory, mercantilist approach. And so the government is starting to dial back a little bit on Chinese investments in sort of what we consider secure areas of our economy. Take the North, take mining and so forth. And so we can cut back on Chinese investment in Canada, which is another tool, if you might say, we have of expressing a little bit our problems, our condemnation of their human rights activities. And it's not getting better. I mean, they're getting tougher on the Uyghurs. They're undercutting what's happening in Hong Kong. They're starting to threaten Taiwan. And all these those three areas are things that Canadians, I think, feel concerned about. So my sense of it is that we will be leaning more heavily on the human rights side. And in that respect, I think the Biden administration will be very supportive, and they themselves will start to weigh in more heavily than Trump did, for example. So there is, misery loves company.
On that note, former ambassador to the U.S., Michael Kerrigan, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Michael. And nice to talk to Nick as well. Thank you very much.
Nick, so what's your final takeaway from all this?
My final takeaway is, the Liberals enjoyed an advantage over the last couple of months when the House was not sitting. Now the House is back. They are in the hot seat on vaccinations, implementation, jabbing Canadians. All the opposition parties are taking swipes. I think we're going to see the margin between the Liberals and the Conservatives especially start to close. And Canadians will increasingly take a look at Erin O'Toole as a possible alternative, and the Conservatives as a government in waiting.
Wow. And Nick, as always, where can we find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Nick, N-I-K, Nanos, or you can visit the website, www.nanos.co, to get all those oodles of stats.
And I'm also on Twitter at Michael Stittle, and you can find more information about what we've discussed in this episode on CTVNews.ca. Thank you for listening.